All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. Really awesome to be able to do these live events. Normally, we'd be broadcasting live into classrooms across North America and beyond. But due to different circumstances, it's pretty darn fun to be able to broadcast live into the homes of parents, educators, and students all across North America. So today's a pretty darn easy lesson to introduce because I'm hosting myself today. So like I said before, my name's Joe. I used to teach math and science. I taught that for about 6 or 7 years before I started exploring by the seat of your pants. And I'm also an explorer with the National Geographic Society. And I work with some other really cool organizations like the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and the Explorers Club as fellows as well. So I was able to go on a really cool expedition not too long ago off the coast of California, hanging out on a ship called the exploration vessel Nautilus, which is Bob Ballard's ship. For those of you who might not be familiar with Bob Ballard, he is the guy who discovered the Titanic, the wreck of the Titanic, as well as deep sea hydrothermal vents, so off the coast of Galapagos for the first time. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go on a little adventure. I'm going to share that experience with everybody. And then, of course, I want a ton of questions afterwards. So let's get that screen share going. And we'll do my whole desktop this time. All right. And let's take this full screen. All right, so for some reason it's not full screen. Someone please let me know, but it should be now. All right, so this is where it started. So I flew to the coast of California, and as someone who's been a diver for over a decade, I wanted to get some scuba diving in first. I'd never been diving in California, and the kelp forests in California were too tempting to pass up. So this might not look like much. You can see the forest in the background, but then if you look into the water, there's a forest there as well. So that's giant kelp you can see growing there. And that kelp doesn't look like much from the top, but when you're underwater, it's 20, 30 feet high, even taller, reaching towards the surface. It's a really cool underwater forest ecosystem, and it is full of life, ranging from harbor seals to tiny little invertebrates like nudibranchs, and starfish. There is a lot going on in a kelp forest. So it was great to be able to dive in there and check it out. So here is myself and another Nat Geo explorer. His name's Tim White. And we were just goofing around a little bit. We had one of our National Geographic flags with us. And so we thought we'd fly the flag during our dive. All right. So it's always fun to explore the land as well. So I had a little time to check out some of the Redwood Forest. And these are beautiful trees, some of the oldest and tallest on the planet. And these ones were just small ones. I know they look huge, but they get much bigger, much fatter. But it was really great to walk through this forest environment and feel that nice cool air in the forest. Now, my friend who I was visiting, he is a freshwater fish biologist. His name's Joe Cutler. And he lives right on the ocean. So we were able to do some tide pooling. That the tide comes in and out twice a day. So 2 high tides, 2 low tides. And when you get those nice low tides, you get the little tide pools in the rocks, and they're full of all kinds of creatures who couldn't make it back to the ocean. And it's really easy to see some really cool life. So here we have this little crab hanging out in the tide pool. We've got a beautiful sea anemone here that if you lick, it tingles your tongue. I'm not going to tell you how I know that, but it is 100% true. This is a bat starfish that we have hanging out here. Another crab making its way through the tide pool, through the rock pool. And then really cool, I've been diving and I've seen octopus in a few different spots, but they've always been really, really big. Bigger than a dinner plate. But it was really neat. We found some of these little ones crawling through the seaweed, crawling through the tide pools. So these little guys were out hunting in the night. So it was really cool to see them so small. All right. So that was my adventure to begin. My other adventure, we had to head down to San Francisco. That's where we met the ship. So here we are, downtown San Francisco, and we met the exploration vessel Nautilus there. So here, let me show you a shot of the Nautilus. So 6 months or more a year, the Nautilus is out in the ocean, doing a series of expeditions, exploring all kinds of areas of the deep sea and different national marine sanctuaries around the US, particularly, and using really cool technology to explore that deep sea. So there's the science crew was about 40, and then there were also the crew of the ship, so engineers and such on board to make sure everything was running smoothly. So we left San Francisco. You can see we're going under the Golden Gate Bridge here, heading out into the open ocean. So just a few shots as we make our way out. And there's another shot there looking back at the Golden Gate Bridge. And then we were there to use these really cool machines. So we were exploring an area of the ocean, the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. We were exploring depths over 3 kilometers deep. Anybody who scuba dives knows you can't go anywhere near that deep. The limit of recreational is usually between 130, 150 feet. You can go deeper, like say 200 to 500 feet, doing some crazy technical diving. But if you want to go really deep, you've got to use these machines, these remotely operated vehicles. So this is Hercules that you have a nice close up here. I'm going to start the video so you can see a little bit of Hercules being launched. So Hercules is 5,000 pounds, costs several $1 million to build. It is covered in gear, from lights to high definition cameras to, if you look at the sides, you can see sample containers for taking water samples, sample containers for taking rock and animal biological samples. You can see the big gripper arms up on the front. You can see the cable that's used to tether Hercules to the ship. That's got all the fiber optics in it, so it can beam the video signal up to us. So that's what it looks like, taking that big Hercules, 5,000 pounds, and lowering Hercules into the water. And on this particular dive, Hercules was down for over 36 hours on this dive. All right. Let's jump to the next slide here. This is Argos. This is Hercules' companion. So this is another ROV. So Hercules can go to 4,000 meters. Argus can go to 6,000. But what Argus acts as is kind of a tether. So Hercules is down at the bottom looking. Argos is maybe 50 feet above, and it absorbs the movement of the ship. So if you've ever seen a ship on the ocean that's bouncing up and down, it wouldn't be very good for Hercules if that was happening. So Argus can absorb that motion so Hercules can stay nice and steady at the bottom. And then Argus also has a camera so that it can watch Hercules from above if it gets entangled or under an overhang or something like that. So the two ROVs always go in together as a team. This is a little map of where we were exploring. So let me show you up here. This is where we left. This is San Francisco Bay. We came all the way out here, way out to a spot called Davidson Seamount. And so this is underwater volcano, dormant for 9 million years. And it's a spot that, so it's a seamount now, it's not a volcano anymore. And it's a spot that hasn't been explored a lot. So part of the area we're exploring has never been seen by human eyes before, which is a pretty cool kind of exploration to be doing something for the first time. And what did we find? Well, we found a lot of really cool things here. So the first thing we have here, this is a Pictogonin, or some people might call it a sea spider. And to give you an idea, those two little lasers you see, those lasers can be turned on and off, and they're used to take measurements to figure out how big things are. So in this case, those lasers were 10 centimeters apart. So that means that that Pictogonin was probably about a foot in diameter. So pretty big and pretty cool. So that's an example of something that we saw. Now, this is something that's very scary. It doesn't look scary maybe to you, but if you're an ROV pilot, if you're driving an ROV from a control room, and you see something like this, it makes you nervous. So this is an old fishing net. This must have been discarded from a ship or blown off of a ship and then sank to the bottom 3 kilometers. And now it's ghost fishing. So capturing sea life that maybe swims too close and any ROV that's unlucky enough to get trapped. So I don't think I have to tell you that an ROV getting tangled 3 kilometers below the ocean is not easy to retrieve. So the ROV pilot had to be really careful to make their way around an obstacle like this. But did we ever see a lot of cool things? So this is some creatures feeding. So at the bottom of the sea, you might not think there's a lot of life. There's actually a lot of biodiversity, and we're going to see some of that today. And there's a lot of nutrients. So where does that nutrients come from? It comes from the surface. So anything that dies makes its way down to the bottom. And so there's a ton of nutrients at the bottom. As Hercules was making its way down, it took 3 hours to get down 3 kilometers. There was it looked like snow falling in the water. Well, that snow is called marine snow, and it's actually organic matter, dead plankton, dead zooplankton, slowly sinking to the bottom. And this is an example of something bigger. This is a piece of kelp that drifted out and sank to the bottom. And so these are called sea pigs, and these are urchins, and they're having a little feast on this kelp that drifted down to the bottom. And then we have really cool adaptations in the deep sea. It's obviously total darkness. So for example, this lizardfish here, it doesn't see. Instead, it uses senses like its lateral line. So you can see this line down the body. It can help it detect pressure changes in the water, and it's an ambush predator. So its mouth kind of looks like a big crocodile mouth, and it waits and it waits and it waits until something swims over top and then nabs it. So it's pretty cool, this lizardfish. Even way offshore and 3 kilometers deep, we still find evidence of human activity. So you can see this Dr. Pepper can down here. We saw all kinds of things ranging from paint cans to balloons, all kinds of stuff that we discard either intentionally or accidentally drifts out into the ocean and then eventually sinks down to the bottom like this can. So lots of science work going on. So if you can picture like a container, like a shipping container, like you see on the big shipping boats out on the ocean. So this is what sits on the top deck of the exploration vessel Nautilus. And inside is a whole team. So there's a team who are driving the ROV, the pilots. There is a team of navigators. There's a team of scientists along the back who are looking at the cameras and identifying things and deciding what they want to take samples of. There's a video team. And then myself, I was a science communication fellow. So I was talking to everybody who was tuning into this live. So every dive we did was broadcast live around the world. So everybody saw what we were seeing, and we could talk to the scientists and answer questions. It really was a lot of fun. So this is one of Hercules' arms, and it's taken a sample here of a sea sponge. So sea sponges are really cool. They're animals, but they don't have any eyes or lungs or brains or hearts, anything you'd think of a normal animal having. But what they're really good at is filtering the water. So they filter the water all day long for things like little bacteria and such. Here is Hercules taking another sample. Sometimes things are really delicate, so we use the slurp. And this is basically a vacuum cleaner, and Hercules is holding onto it with a hockey puck, and it's slurping up some of this sponge, taking a sample of this sponge for the scientists to see. And then if you look at the front of this picture, you can see up here is a little bin where rock samples are taken and dropped in. And then this is some of the bins where some of the samples are collected, and then they can be pulled inside of Hercules to keep them safe when they come back up to the surface. So that's a little bit of sample collection going on there. And I said there was lots of life, lots of biodiversity in the ocean, and I wasn't kidding. So this is just a small little piece of the ocean floor, and there's a lot going on here. So we have a sea anemone here standing up nice and tall. We've got an acorn worm right over here, and it's making its way along the bottom and leaving this trail of waste. You can see where it's gone by the trail of waste. Things come in and then they come out the other end. We've got some deep sea coral over here. We've got some crinids here that are drifting through the water. There's one there, there's another one there. So lots of things going on in the deep sea. We have better maps of Mars and the moon than we do of the bottom of our ocean. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% of our ocean still needs to be mapped really well at the bottom. So there is a lot left for us to explore and discover. And there's a lot of new life and new species left for us to discover. Here's a pretty cool looking octopus. Special scientific name is Octopus Robustus. And you can see it's drifting along the bottom. And then here's another fish that's kind of adapted to the deep sea. This is a cuss eel. And you can see, again, it doesn't have a lot of coloration. You can see the lines down the body to detect pressure changes. And then it's got these extra little whiskers that can help it kind of feel around a little bit of what's going on. So I have a couple cool videos here to share with some pretty cool creatures. You're going to love this one. So this is an octopus. Sometimes people call it a Dumbo octopus. Sometimes people call it an umbrella octopus. And I think you'll see why it gets both of those names as you watch this video. So you can see right away, those kind of look like ears like Dumbo the elephant. Of course, those aren't ears, those are fins that it uses to move through the water. And then in a moment, you're gonna get a sneak peek at why it gets that name, umbrella octopus. Look at that. Pretty darn cool. And here we go, opening up for us. So that's the neat thing, is we have no idea if this is rare, if this is a rare species, if we're really lucky, or if all throughout the deep sea, there's lots and lots of these octopus. So much, like I said, to explore and discover. And there we go, a nice big umbrella view there. That's pretty cool. All right. And then we made another really cool discovery that went viral after we found it. So let's go to that. I've got a little video here to show you. So we talked about that octopus, that Octopus Robustus. And so we were at about the end of our dive, 36 hours, Hercules have been in the water. And then we noticed this group of them sitting in the water, all turned upside down, about a dozen of them. And we were kind of like, well, what's up with this? So we got a little closer. And if you look really closely here, you can see that they're upside down and over eggs. These are all female octopus. They're brooding or protecting their eggs. So they're turned upside down. They're protecting their eggs. They're making sure they don't get eaten. They're making sure water's moving over top of them. And so we looked a little further and saw more. So we started to follow them. They're kind of in these little faults in the rock surface. So we started to follow them, and a dozen turned into 50, turned into 100, turned into hundreds, and then thousands. So we found the deepest, largest group of brooding octopus ever discovered. So there may be larger gatherings in the deep ocean, but at the moment, this is the largest that's ever been found. And as long as we kept moving the ROV, we kept finding more and more and more of them, all turned upside down, all protecting their eggs. So some of these female octopus and other species that are more shallow, sometimes they protect their eggs for 2 to 4 years. The eggs hatch and then the female octopus dies. So we don't know how long that these ones spend turned upside down like this, protecting their eggs. You can see there's more and more and more as the video continues. And then we got really close, because this is supposed to be inactive, but when we got really close with the cameras, we could see the water shimmering around the octopus. And what that means is it's probably a little bit warmer in these little cracks, and that there's still some heat seeping out from the earth. And this is why the octopus decide this is a good spot to be brooding their eggs. And so we unfortunately couldn't take a temperature on this dive because we didn't have the thermometer part on Hercules, but it was really neat to see that there's still some activity on this seamount, and there is still heat escaping from the earth. And look at what it's done. It's got this amazing colony of these octopus. And so you can see, this is the view from Argos, the other ROV, looking down at Hercules. And if you look really closely, it might not be so well for you because I'm sharing my screen, but the water's shimmering around the octopus. And that shows that there's warmer water coming up from inside of the seamount, which is pretty awesome. And it was unexpected. All right, let's wrap up here and then let's get to some Q&A action. So here's one more shot. This is Argos looking down at Hercules as Hercules is taking those images for us, taking that really sweet video. And then life at sea is pretty interesting. So this is our broadcast room. So every day we broadcast to schools and groups and museums and share what we were doing out in the ocean. So this is what it looks like on a good day. This is what it looks like on a bad day. This is what happens when the swell kicks up and the waves are really high. So we hit some big swell. I'm going to share this little video. So it looks like a beautiful, nice day, but look how much the ship is moving as we move through this section of the ocean. So as you can imagine, it makes things kind of tricky to move around the ship. Things were flying off the shelves. The cooks were having a really hard time. Things were breaking all over the place. You can see just how much we go down, and then we go down the same amount on the other side. So although it didn't look like a stormy day, there was definitely a lot of swell in the water that day. And then sometimes you're looking out at the ocean and you see nothing for hours and hours and hours, just ocean, ocean, ocean. And then sometimes life explodes all around you. This is a huge pod of dolphins that just came out of nowhere and started chasing the ship. So you really have to watch in this video. All those splashes around us are dolphins. They're a really small species of dolphin. You can see them all jumping in front. They're playing in the front of the ship, in the bow. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these dolphins all chasing the ship in this massive pod of dolphins. You can see them jumping here. As far as we can see, it is all splashes from the dolphins jumping. So a lot of the time it's quiet. It's almost like a desert. And then out of nowhere, the ocean can come to life in really exciting ways. So as far as you can see here, all these splashes, we've got hundreds. This is a huge pod of dolphins chasing us here. You can get a closer view of some of them as they're playing in the waves here. And then just as quickly as they appeared, they disappeared. So it was just a fleeting moment where they surrounded the ship and then had a little bit of fun and then decided we were boring and they went off on their way. And then it was Halloween. So I was on board the ship over Halloween. So we tried to look around and find some costumes that we could have to celebrate Halloween on board. Of course, they were nautical or sea themed. And before we left, I was in San Francisco and my little guy, his name's Finn. He's 7. He's a huge Pokemon fan. So I found a full body Pikachu suit here. And then I put a scuba mask on top. So I wasn't Pikachu, I was Scuba Chew. I changed the name to Scuba Chew for that. So he was pretty excited to see the pictures. And I went to one of the live streaming cameras and stood in front so you could see what I looked like in the Pikachu costume, Scuba Chew. All right, let's come back from that screen share because I would love to meet some of the groups we have hanging out with us on camera. I would love to take some questions from all the groups that we have. Oh, a nice big group tuning in online via YouTube. Let's try and do a few shout outs here. Let's see. Okay, so we've got a first question here on YouTube, and this one is about the sea anemone and why it tingled the tongue if you lick it. So my friend Joe, he is loves freshwater fish, but he's also a tide pool nut. He loves tide pooling, knows everything about all the different creatures you could find in the tide pools. You could talk about them for days and days and days. And it was his idea to lick the sea anemone because they have little, they're called nematocysts, little stingers that they use to stun their prey. So if you're a really tiny fish or something really tiny, getting stung by a sea anemone is, pretty intense, and that's how they catch their prey. But if you're something as big as a human, it just feels like a little tingle on your tongue. So that's what happened with that story there. All right. So let's start meeting some of our camera groups. Let's start off with Amy and Isabella hanging out with us in Indiana. Let me turn that microphone on. All right, we're ready for you.
So the Hercules would take samples of things, and you said sometimes it takes like marine biology life. Have you ever noticed how things like it would take a photo, and then when you actually were touching it, if it changed at all due to the pressure?
Okay, that's a really good question. So you're right. A lot of the life down in the deep sea is adapted to living under more pressure. So if anybody out there isn't sure why that happens, well, you just have to see what it's like if your brother or sister lays on top of you. You feel that pressure pushing down on you. Well, every time you go deeper and deeper into the ocean, more and more water above you is pushing down on you. More and more weight is pushing down on you. So the deeper you go in the ocean, the more weight you have pushing down. And so if we were suddenly dropped at 3 kilometers at the bottom of the ocean, well, it would not be good for our bodies. It's not an experience that we'd come back from. So a lot of animals in the deep sea are adjusted to that. And if they are brought to the surface, especially too quickly, their insides can change, almost explode really in a way. But most of the samples we collected on this particular time were those sponges. There was a scientist on board who was really interested in studying the deep sea sponges and looking for new species of those sponges, stalked crinids and things like that. So most of our samples came up pretty similar to how they came up from the bottom. But you're right, there is some life, especially some soft-bodied life. It would not be as recognizable when it made its way back to the surface with that pressure change, especially fast. Really good question.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to Amelia and Owen hanging out with us in Guelph, Ontario. Do you guys have a question?
I do. What's the coolest animal you saw?
On the expedition? Let's see. I would have to go with that Dumbo octopus. So I'd seen them on the Blue Planet and other shows. Never thought that I'd get to see one kind of as close to in person as you can, really, with that deep sea technology. So that was really cool to be able to see. And then we were using something called Dropcams. So a Dropcam is basically a big sphere with a camera inside. And so these cameras can be dropped over the side of the ship. They have a weight on the bottom and they sink all the way down to the bottom, 3, 4, 5 kilometers deep. Big lights turn on the side, and then they take video for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. And then they have little bait on the front to attract fish and other things to come check them out. And then after the time is up, there's a little release of the weight. So it's just a big bag of sand. So it just biodegrades. And the drop cam floats back to the surface. And we're all looking in this massive part of ocean around us for this tiny little ball floating with an orange flag on it. And we pick it up. And then that's another way we can see some really cool things underwater. And on one of them, we saw a really cool deep sea shark. We saw a sleeper shark, which was really cool to see a shark on the drop cam. So that was pretty cool too. Good question. Oh, you want to ask one too, bud? Let me turn your mic on.
What was the biggest animal that you've ever seen in the ocean?
The biggest in the ocean? So for me, I lived in Australia for a year, and the humpback whales, I used to work in a spot where I had a beautiful view of the ocean. And during the year, there was one time of the year where all the whales went one way. They were migrating to the warm waters. And then in another part of the year, they all went the other way, migrating to the cold waters, and they all had their babies with them. So twice during that year, there were days where I'd be working and looking out the big window and seeing tons and tons of humpback whales jumping and breaching out of the water. Massive, massive whales, 40 feet and longer, jumping and breaching out of the water. So that's pretty cool. I've come across gray whales. I've been scuba diving and heard humpback whales singing around me, but never have I been lucky enough to see one while scuba diving. So I hope that happens one day, because that would be pretty cool. Good question. Let's jump back to YouTube. Let's see if we've got anything coming up on YouTube that we can ask here. What was the most expensive thing? Well, on that ship, on the Nautilus, there are a lot of very expensive things, as you can imagine. So I mentioned Hercules is, millions of dollars to build. There is a massive, if you saw in the picture of the ship, there's something at the back that looks like a giant golf ball, big circle. And in that circle is a massive satellite dish that sits on a bunch of gyros. So as the ocean moves, the satellite dish moves around so it can stay locked in one spot. And that's what allows us to broadcast live all over the world, even from the middle of the ocean. So that is definitely a very expensive satellite system. So yeah, as you can imagine, there's lots of broadcasting equipment. There's lots of deep sea equipment that goes down and has to be repaired. So it's a very expensive operation to have one of those ships running. And for 6 months, imagine 6 months and multiple expeditions, a lot of money has to be raised for these deep sea expeditions to happen. All right, let's go back to another camera group. We have some educators who are joining live today. Their students are joining us live via YouTube. So I'm going to start with, let's start in Ontario, I think. Oh no, let's start in New Jersey. So New Jersey, Marlton, New Jersey. We have Mrs. Hiltebittel joining us. Let me turn her mic on and let's see if there's any questions coming from her students.
Hi there. So one of my students is wondering if you have ever gotten hurt in any of your expeditions.
Okay, that's a great question. And the easy answer is no. Luckily, I haven't had anything happen. So scuba diving is, for what you're doing, diving in the ocean, it's actually a relatively safe sport. When things happen during scuba diving, it is usually somebody diving at a level they're not experienced to do, or maybe poor training or making silly mistakes. And one time that I was diving off the coast of North Carolina in a place called the Graveyard of the Atlantic. So there's tons and tons of ships that were sunk during World War II. And I was diving on a German submarine, a U-boat that was sunk in World War II by the Coast Guard, by depth chargers. And so this U-boat was 118 feet down, about 30 miles offshore, and a really strong current. So you had to be really careful and experienced. And somebody was making their way down the anchor line, and they let go of the anchor line to mess with something on their BCD, their buoyancy compensating device, and they got pulled away by the current. And by the time we got to the surface, and their dive partner realized that they were missing, we couldn't just go look for them right away because there were still 15 divers doing decompression stops underneath the boat. So when you dive, nitrogen builds up in your blood and you can't go to the surface too quickly. You have to give it time to off gas to come out of your blood. And so we looked, everybody was looking, binoculars, trying to see if we could spot this person who let go of the line. And we did, we got lucky. She was about 500 or so yards from the ship, but she didn't have a whistle. She didn't have a safety sausage, which is a big, it's rolled up and it's part of your gear. And then if you drift away from the ship, you can use the air from your regulator to blow it up. And it makes like a big 6 foot tall orange flag out of the water. So you can be easily spotted. So things happen on expedition when people don't pay attention, when they don't plan, and they, maybe aren't as experienced as they should be to be on that expedition. So unfortunately, it was a close call, but fortunately we were able to retrieve her and she was okay. So definitely planning, definitely diving at the level you're comfortable at, and training. Let's see. Let's take a little trip now. Let's go to Ontario this time. Mr. McIntyre has some students joining us. Let's get that mic on. Oh, you have to do it for me today, Mr. McIntyre.
Okay. Hiya. So it kind of surprised me hearing you said, I think it was like 95% of that surface of the planet is unexplored. So that kind of begged the question, now that technology is rapidly changing, what's maybe changed over the past few years that's enabled that to become more of a reality? And is there anything upcoming that you guys can see to make it easier and more effective?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So yeah, you're right. Like, we have very detailed maps of the moon. We have very detailed maps of Mars, but the bottom of our ocean, only about 5% has been mapped in great detail. And so technology is going to change that. So before we were using something called a single beam sonar. So it basically, as the ship goes over top, it sends a beam down, and that beam is bounced back up, and that it kind of shows a picture and a line that the ship is traveling, and it gives us kind of the contours that we have down there. Now, ships like the Nautilus use a system called a multi-beam sonar. So it sends out a giant beam out and across the bottom of the ocean, sends the signal back, and we can get much bigger pathways as the ship moves across the ocean. So that's one technological advance that can help us map more. And we map these areas, and then scientists look at them later and they pick which areas they want to explore. So they can see, oh, that seamount looks interesting, or that area looks interesting. They can come back and explore them. And now a lot of work is going to start being done by UAVs, so underwater autonomous vehicles. So some of them look like torpedoes. Basically, they're launched off of ships. They can be programmed to do a search pattern, and then they can be left alone in the water. And they can go back and forth along the bottom, taking pictures, doing sonar scans, and mapping out the bottom. So yeah, those are some of the advances that are allowing us to map more and more and more. It's cool to jump into a submersible, 3 people squeeze into a submersible, or send down an ROV, but it really gives you a limited view, a view we need because we get to see lots of really cool things. But some of those technologies, especially the UAVs and stuff, I think are really going to help us look at our ocean floor better and find out more. Let's see, Barrie, Vermont. We've got Mr. Crawford Stemple joining us. Let's turn that microphone on. There we go. How you doing?
Hey, that's very cool. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's a great view into some of the things that we're studying in school, and I know many of us would love to do someday is to get involved with that. So I got 2 questions, and
Sure.
If you have time, great. You can both. One is just about the kinds of adaptations for life down there. Like obviously it's cold, great pressure, darkness. In terms of like some of the really interesting kinds of adaptations that are there. And the second question would be how, I've got high school students, so how would they go on to become marine biologists who are on expeditions like this?
All right, good question, or 2 very good questions. So, all right, let's talk about some adaptations first. So, what we see a lot in the deep sea, and we see this in caves too, which is actually really cool, is that a lot of things we see are bodies. So we see a lot of bodies that are transparent. We see a lot of bodies that are white. And that's because color, absence of light just doesn't really mean a lot down there. It's just not really necessary. We see a lot of adaptations that allow the creatures to hunt and sense their environments. So we see things like those kind of whiskers we saw on the cuss eel. We see those really small eyes that don't really do a lot, those lateral line systems that are really developed so that they can feel those pressure changes in the water. And you see a lot of bioluminescence as well in the deep ocean, which is really cool. And so some of those animals, like the anglerfish, can use the bioluminescence to hunt, to help attract their prey with that little bit of light, which is another really cool adaptation that they're able to use. So yeah, there's things like you said, there's the deep, the depth, there's the cold, there's the pressure. These are all things that the animals have to cope with. And what's really cool about a lot of animals in the deep sea is with it being so cold, their metabolisms are slower. which means they can live a lot longer and they can grow a lot larger. So for instance, the Greenland shark, amazing species of shark, can grow to be over 21 feet or longer. And there's evidence that scientists have caught ones that are 200 to 300 years old. So slower life cycles, slower growth, longer life. Those are all some adaptations that come about when animals are living in those colder, deep environments. Let's see, it's something about pressure. I'll have a think about the pressure and see if I can think of a good one to share about the pressure. But I've got a good one for how students can get involved. So the easy and obvious one is be curious. If you're passionate about something, learn about it, research it, find a way to volunteer, keep up to date, those kind of things. But organizations, especially an organization like the Ocean Exploration Trust, which is the organization that Bob Ballard runs, and with the EV Nautilus, they take interns on. So these interns are university students. So every expedition has interns for video, for ROV piloting, for science. What else? There's one other one I'm missing, for science communication. So those are really cool opportunities to apply for, get yourself out and get yourself some training in that deep sea activity. And then another one is to find a mentor. So I want to give you a really good example. I want to give you a story here. So this story, Joe McGinnis is a famous Canadian diver, and he was a medical doctor as well. He was doing a lot of building of habitats for Navy divers for the deep, for the cold, so they could work underwater for longer. And so after one expedition, he got a handwritten letter from a kid in Ontario, maybe 10 or 11 years old. And the letter said, hey, can you send me the blueprints for the underwater habitat? I'd like to build my own. And so it would have been easy for him. This is when letters still existed. You didn't have email back then, but it would have been easy to ignore him. It would have been easy to maybe respond and just say, hey, thanks for the letter. Glad you're tuning in. And then leave it at that. But he sent back a version of the plans he was allowed to send. He gave him advice on materials to use to build a small model. And sure enough, this boy built that model and then got a mouse and put it inside and lowered it off a bridge into the river. And happy story, the mouse survived. It's becoming a mouse squanaut or an aquanaut, whatever you would call it, a mouse that went underwater. And then that kid grew up to be James Cameron. And so James Cameron is, some of you may know, he's a director, very famous director, movies like The Abyss and obviously the Avatar movies, Titanic. But he's also quite a famous ocean explorer. He's one of, I believe, 5 people now who have been to the deepest point, no, 4 people have been to the deepest point of the ocean on his Challenger Deep mission. So yeah, finding a mentor is huge. So Joe is they still work together. Joe is on a lot of his expeditions as a dive medic. So reaching out to somebody in that field and getting to know them and asking questions is really valuable. And that person can kind of be a gateway to help you find what you want to do. Yeah, good questions. Let's dive back into YouTube for another minute here. Okay, here's a great question. Has an animal ever attacked Hercules, the ROV? So the short answer is not really. I mean, sometimes the lights attract animals to come close. Some of the animals who don't like the sounds Hercules make are gone before we get a chance to see them. So nothing's really attacked them. But if you go to nautiluslive.org, they post highlight videos of some amazing things that have been seen on the dives. And one of my favorite is with a sperm whale. So Hercules was descending in the water, and all of a sudden this massive shape, this massive eye filled the camera. And it was this big sperm whale that was just super curious about what Hercules was, just bobbing in front of Hercules. So pretty wild to see this whale hanging out with the ROV as it was made its way through the water. I can definitely tell you the scientists and the ROV pilots were not expecting that. But no, nothing has really ever seriously attacked Hercules. Let's see. Let's grab one more from YouTube and then visit our live groups one more time. Okay, so lots of questions about scary things seen on expedition, the length of expeditions. Has the ship ever been damaged? This is a good question. We did have something happen on this particular expedition. This just goes to show you, you can never really know what's going to happen on an expedition. You have to be ready for the unexpected and be flexible and have backup plans. So as we were retrieving Hercules from the very first dive, something happened. There was a pinch in the cable and it lost power. So something happened that broke that fiber optic connection. So we were able to still retrieve Hercules. Then we had to do a speed run down to San Diego. So it took about a day, and then have the entire 4 kilometers of cable unspooled, find the spot where the split happened with the fiber optics, and then repair and then get back out into the water. So anything can happen on an expedition. Equipment doesn't cooperate. One time we were about to put Hercules in the water and something burst a valve and oil started spraying everywhere. So we had to hold off and make some repairs before we could get it back into the water. So yeah, anything can happen on an expedition, and you have to be adaptable and ready for those changes and have 6 backup plans, because you just don't know what's going to work and what could happen on an expedition. Amy and Isabella.
You showed a photo of sea urchins investigating a Dr. Pepper can. Have you seen the effects firsthand of what trash and pollution does to marine life?
All right, good question. So yeah, the really good example was that ghost fishing, that ghost net. So those nets, I mean, obviously aren't actively being used by humans. That's why it's called ghost fishing. And they are being they're still catching marine life. Anything that happens to swim too closely or drift past gets caught in it and generally dies. So that was probably the best example that we saw down at the bottom with marine life that was trapped inside of that fishing net. And so that is a problem. There's a massive amount of plastic in our oceans. About a dump truck every minute of plastic is dumped into our ocean. That's about 8 million tons a year. So it is a lot of plastic. But there's some cool organizations looking to kind of get those fish nets out of the water. So there's one in Chile, they're called Barreo, and they pay the fishermen some money to take their old fishing nets, to take their discarded fishing nets, and then they turn them into usable things. So here, this is a skateboard, and it's entirely made from fish nets in Chile. So they take the fish nets, they recycle the plastic down, and then they make these skateboards out of them. So that's a really good example of something that's being done to deal with things like that ghost fishing, to try and keep the nets from going into the water, because it entices the fishermen to keep them if they can get something for them when they've been used. Let's go back to New Jersey and see if there's a question.
Okay, so one of my students wanted to know if you have ever discovered a new species while you were out on an expedition.
I wish, because if you discover a new species, then you have an opportunity to name it. And I think that would be pretty darn cool. But there's something we should say about discovering new species. One is that there's still a ton left to be explored and discovered, especially in our oceans, in the rainforest, in caves. There's a lot that we need to find in extreme environments. So extremophiles that can live in environments you wouldn't think life would be able to survive in. Lots of cool life left to be found. And I do have some friends, some fellow Nat Geo explorers who have discovered species. My friend Joe, who studies fish in East Africa, has discovered some freshwater fish species. My friend Isai lives in Patagonia, has discovered a lot of cool insect species. But it's not like you just walk into the field and go, hey, that's a new species. I'm calling you this, done. That's not the way it works. Sometimes it can take a year and even longer before you can officially say you have a new species and it's identified. So you have to find it, you have to document it, you have to put it out there for the scientific community to look at, and other people to say, no, we've seen that before, or whatnot. So it can take up to a year to 2 years to describe a new species. So it's not a quick process. And I hope one day I'm lucky enough to be on an expedition where we find something and go through the whole process. So we'll see. Mr. McIntyre, do you have another question from your group?
Not at the moment right now, sir.
No pressure?
Yeah.
All right. And we'll check in with our other group, Mr. Crawford Stemple. Any more questions?
Just one other question. I know you are, mapping is one of the big things you talked about. What other kinds of studies are being done right now in the deep sea?
Sure. Yeah, so mapping is obviously a big one, obviously an important one to try and figure out what's down there. There's lots of groups like Schmidt Ocean Institute and the RV Falkor, which is their research vessel. They look at a lot of different things like hydrothermal vents. So they look at the life that can live around these hydrothermal vents. It's really unique life because, you know, all the life here on Earth gets energy from the sun one way or another. But when you've got these deep hydrothermal vents, they're not getting their energy from the sun. They're getting it from chemicals that come out of the Earth. So the bacteria is able to convert those chemicals into usable energy, and then other creatures can eat that bacteria, and that can build up a little food system, an amazing food system on these hydrothermal vents, on these black smokers. So I highly suggest you check out some video afterwards of these black smokers, of these hydrothermal vents on the bottom of the ocean, these massive ecosystems on these big, tall vents, these plumes pouring out, looks like black smoke, but it's actually just superheated water. And they're all, this ecosystem is surviving, you know, without the sun, which is pretty cool. So studying that, there's methane seeps, which release a lot of gas. So methane seeping from the Earth, it comes up as bubbles, and then those obviously come to the surface and are released in the air. So there's lots of studies to try and figure out how those contribute to global warming. So tons of biology being done, trying to learn how chemiosynthesis, so using chemicals as a form of energy, works. And then there's just a lot of stuff going on, just looking at biodiversity, looking at what kind of life is there, the relationships it has. And then there's lots of work looking at some of these deep sea corals and other things, looking for things like medicine and other things that we can use in our everyday life. And then some people are studying to figure out if we can mine the deep sea. There's all kinds of nodules of different elements and such, like magnesium that can be found in the bottom of the ocean, important elements that we could use you know, up here. But there's a lot of study that needs to go on to make sure that it's safe to do that. It's not going to damage the ecosystem too much. Personally, myself, I think it's not a great idea, but that is a lot of kind of deep sea work that's going on right now. And there's cool ships like the Joydes Resolution that go way out into the ocean, massive drill rigs on the top of the ship, and they drill deep down into the crust of the Earth because it's obviously thinner in the ocean. There's not as much to go through when you're on the land. If you're in the ocean, you can go through the water for several miles, then start drilling. You can drill nice and deep down and get really cool core samples. We had an event with them not too long ago where they were drilling into an active volcano on the bottom of the seafloor, which was pretty cool. So, I mean, it's easier sometimes maybe to talk about what's not being studied deep in the ocean right now, because there's lots of research going on exploring our ocean. All right. Well, I can see I've gone over 45 minutes, but it was a lot of fun to hang out with all the groups today. It was great to see so many tuning in to YouTube and sending in all kinds of questions. Actually, there's one more I can't resist to answer here. And someone asked about the food. And let me tell you, food on an expedition ship out in the ocean is pretty darn good. We had tons of food every night, all prepared really well by the cooks on board. And that's another point, is you may not be a scientist, but there's a ton of jobs out for you on the ocean and ocean science, whether it's an engineer, whether it's working with the equipment, the video equipment, whether it's, you know, being a cook on board of one of the ships. There are dozens and dozens of jobs you can have working in deep sea exploration. And you don't necessarily have to be a scientist, but the food was incredible. The only bad part was when we got back to port, we had to load the ship for the next expedition. And so it was crate after crate after crate of food. We had to form like a human chain all the way along the ship and pass the food for what felt like hours. It probably wasn't actually hours, but it was a big, long human chain to get the food on board the ship, down into the hold, and tucked away for the next journey. All right. Well, a big shout out to all the groups who joined live on camera today. Thank you for the questions. Great to see the educators and families joining in. And yeah, we run 3 to 4 of these live events a day with scientists and explorers and adventurers and conservationists from all over the world. So we hope to see your groups tuning in a whole lot more. So again, thanks everyone for hanging out today, and we'll see you on another Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. Thanks everyone.